Good evening. My name is Marva Gertz, and I'm the Director of Alumni and Development here at Ambrose University. Thank you for joining us this evening for our public lecture with Dr. Joel Thiessen. I'd like to introduce you first, though, to Dr. Kyle Jansen. He is the Dean of Arts and Sciences, to introduce this evening's lecture.
Dr. Joel Thiessen is Professor of Sociology, Director of the Flourishing Congregations Institute, and Chair of Social Sciences Department here at Ambrose University. During his 16-plus years at Ambrose, he has authored or co-authored 6 books, along with many articles related to topics such as religion in Canada, religious nuns, congregations, and millennials. Drawing on this research, he regularly speaks and consults with Canadian church and denominational groups. His lecture today draws on an emerging research interest of his related to death and dying. I count Joel as both a colleague and friend, and am delighted that you and I can learn from his expertise in this virtual public lecture.
Thank you, Marva and Kyle, for the kind introductions, and thank you to everyone who has decided to watch this public lecture. It's an honor and a privilege to deliver this talk at Ambrose on an emerging area of research interest for me. I recently attended an Ash Wednesday service at an Anglican parish. I find this service among the most meaningful in the Christian year because of the way we are reminded of our mortality through the ritual of having burnt ashes placed on our forehead in the shape of a cross. Ashes formed by burning palm branches from Palm Sunday the year prior. This act is followed by the words, "Remember you are dust, and to dust you shall return." In this Ash Wednesday service, the priest began his homily by sharing the following story of leading a funeral for a parishioner. After leading the funeral, the priest was graveside with the family. The priest was standing to the right of the hole in the ground that the body would soon be lowered into. He started the graveside service by saying, "Let us pray," at which point someone's Google Maps loudly interjected, "Your final destination is to your left." As horrifying as the timing of this message was, Google Maps wasn't wrong. Our final destination is to the left. In this lecture, I will explore the topic of dying and living well in late modern society. I will advance the claim held by many who research the topic of death that to die well is to live well. I will address this subject by drawing on theoretical and conceptual tools in sociology alongside empirical data centered on human attitudes, behaviors, and experiences. My goal is to describe and explain societal approaches to death and dying, notably in modern Western society, including Canada. In turning to sociology, of course, there are many disciplinary entrances to the question of living and dying well, with many distinct and valuable contributions from philosophy to theology, English, anthropology, and science, among others. As such, this talk may leave you wanting more, mainly because the limits of sociology may not give you the specificity, clarity, or certainty that you desire. Nevertheless, my hope is to draw on a sociological framework to provoke you to think broadly and deeply, hopefully and possibly even in new ways, about dying and living well in late modern society. I begin by distinguishing between 2 kinds of deaths, and perhaps there are other deaths that we can consider as well: physical death and social death. I imagine that when many of us think about death and dying, we immediately imagine physical death. Yet another kind of death that sociologists give concerted attention to is social death. A social death is most readily apparent with the physical death of a loved one that can leave us feeling empty because part of how we see ourselves and experience the world is through our human relationships. As Canadian philosopher Charles Taylor states in his 2007 book, A Secular Age, quote, "The greatest crisis around death comes from the death of someone we love," end quote. Yet social death goes beyond physical death. We experience social death when we are cut off from social ties for a myriad of reasons. For example, a chronic illness like cancer or dementia might result in individuals and their caregivers no longer participating in social life in ways they used to, whether at work or family or church or volunteering or social events, which might include for some moving into continuing a long-term care context that removes one from most or all of their familiar social worlds. Divorce, retirement, graduating from school, job loss, or leaving a religious group are all examples of what sociologists call role exit, that includes a type of social death when we leave certain roles and responsibilities. Examples of a social death extend to those on the margins of social life, often related to social inequalities tied to social class, race, gender, disability, or religion. Being excluded from different forms of social connection and involvement is akin to a social death for some. Of course, those on the margins of society don't only confront social death, but physical death is often part of their ongoing consciousness and experience too. For example, for those who are unhoused or whose lives are threatened due to racism. In studying physical and social death, sociologists are interested in social constructions of a good death versus a bad death. There is consensus in sociological research that a bad death is defined as social or physical death coming too early, as defined by a society. For example, the death of a child, death at the hands of another through murder or war, death due to climate disasters, or death from an illness. In many cases, social death precedes physical death, where a child or adult is cut off socially from others due to a chronic illness or social norms and structures that marginalize certain populations. Conversely, a good death is defined as the convergence of physical and social death. For example, someone who dies rather suddenly and peacefully in old age. Canadian data on cause of death as well as age at time of death suggests that fewer experience a good death defined in this way. Hence, an anchoring question for our consideration is, what does it mean to die and live well in late modern society? Can one die and live well even if their physical and social death do not align? Peter Berger, one of the most influential scholars to shape my work as a sociologist, wrote extensively in the 1960s about the role that society plays to provide structure and order to our daily lives. Berger's work has informed sociological research into death and dying, including research by Tony Walter, whose image you see here. Walter is Emeritus Professor of Death Studies at the University of Bath and past director of the Center for Death and Society. In his 2015 chapter, Sociological Perspectives on Death, Dying, and Bereavement, Walter states, quote, "Social order staves off the chaos brought by death," end quote. What he means by this is that death is socially mediated. Society provides us with language, structures, rituals, emotions, norms, customs, and meaning and order to help interpret, make sense of, and experience death. For instance, we are socialized to learn the correct emotion in delivering and receiving news about a terminal illness, with variations based on whether this is a doctor or patient, parent, or a child giving or receiving the message. Put another way, our responses to death are not purely or even primarily individual or unique to us, though it may feel that way. Instead, society provides us with tools and frameworks for defining and dealing with what Émile Durkheim, French sociologist, identifies as anomie or normlessness in the face of chaos introduced by death. This is why ways of defining, processing, and marking death varies around the world. We bring different cultural assumptions to the question of what it means to die and live well in late modern society. A key framework for understanding how and why we approach death as we do in late modern society, notably in the modern Western world, is found in the summary and comparison provided by Tony Walter. The summation is partially informed by a classic text by French medieval historian Philippe Ariès in his 1974 book, Western Attitudes Toward Death, From the Middle Ages to the Present. A traditional approach to death was marked by two realities. First, people were constantly surrounded by death. For example, life expectancy was much shorter than it is today. It was not uncommon for children to die due to different diseases. People typically died from acute rather than chronic illnesses, meaning the dying process was much shorter and people had less time or notice to prepare for death versus what many are accustomed to today. As a result, people were once very familiar with and socialized into death. As Walter says, quote, "In the midst of life, we are in death," end quote. In this vein, death and dying were also public acts. People often died in their homes surrounded by loved ones. Friends and family would visit the dead on their deathbed, a ritual often seen to be as important as the funeral or burial. Second, death was framed in religious terms. People placed their trust in tradition, the community, and religious professionals, for example, to pray for healing, where priests were seen as more useful than doctors for many up to the 19th century. Further, death marks surrendering to one's destiny, ultimately to something or someone beyond one's control. For instance, humans could not control earthquakes, disease, or famine that could result in loss of life. Death was believed to be the result of the gods' activity or inactivity or fate. In Christian context, this meant an orientation to death where one's death was in God's hands, who alone determined and/or controlled one's time on earth. In this sense, humans lacked control, and thus a good life and death meant surrendering and submitting control over one's life and death to God. In contrast, modern approaches to death are sometimes characterized as hidden or forgotten, where death is denied or invisible to many. In contrast to a religious-based framing of death, modern death takes on a medical-centered understanding. Here, trust is placed in science, technology, and medicine to help control death, personified through the expertise of medical professionals and located in hospitals where people would die. For example, in an effort to mitigate against the risks of life and strengthen human control over death, vaccines and other medicines were created to prevent or treat illness, and sanitation practices were improved. As Tony Walter summarizes, quote, "Death is no longer in the midst of us. It appears to have been controlled. We have placed our deaths, like our lives, in the hands of experts and expertise. The rise of the individual and the collapse of community have undermined the authority of tradition. We no longer know how to deal with death when it comes, so we pay professionals, either directly or through taxation, to handle it for us. In a de-traditionalized society, the expert rules," end quote. In contrast to a traditional approach to death that surrenders control over one's life and death to God, a good life and death in modern society is reflected in the degree of control that one has. In this modern quest for greater control through science, technology, medicine, doctors, and hospitals, one outcome is that death is pushed to the margins of social life, where death is hidden from public view and discourse. For example, recent data reveals that 40% of Canadians die in hospitals, with more dying in long-term care spaces. As a side point, it's interesting to note that many wish to die at home. This is increasingly challenging in a modern society oriented toward professional experts who deal with death and dying. Limited home care supports are available, plus family members lack the expertise, time, or capacity to provide care for loved ones. Research shows that women are far more likely to take on a caregiving role, which takes on immense physical and emotional toll on caregivers, referred to as the caregiver burden. Related to physically sequestering death, grief is also privatized and hidden in the modern approach to death, in part because death is not all around us as it was in traditional societies, and thus we are not socialized into the dying and death process. Bracketing out death by hiding it or avoiding it is also a way of coping with fear of death. To confront death constantly risks unsettling personal and group meaning in daily life. Some scholars argue that death denial and individualism fuel fear and panic surrounding death. I don't have time to get into this literature, but there's a lot of research that explores the social factors that it can amplify or reduce fear in the face of suffering and/or death. For example, research by the Lancet Group accentuates the importance of death literacy to help reduce fears. In her book, The Lost Art of Dying, Lydia Dugdale, professor of medicine and director of the Center for Clinical Medical Ethics at Columbia University, counters a modern take on death, saying, quote, "People who want to die well must be willing to confront their finitude. We do not have to accept death, invite it, or wish for it, but we must be prepared to say, yes, I am human and therefore mortal. One day I will die. We cannot both cling to the indefinite extension of life and effectively prepare for death," end quote. For Dugdale, a good life and death involves accepting our finitude. I suspect many of you could think of those in your life who have not or did not come to terms with their finitude and the ripple effects for how they live their life, approach relationships, and so forth. Dugdale's statement on accepting our finitude is one aspect to grappling with what it means to die well and thus to live well, especially when our physical and social deaths do not align. Finally, there is the postmodern, or what I prefer to describe as a late modern approach to death and dying. Following British sociologist Anthony Giddens, I speak of late rather than postmodernity to capture the acceleration of social shifts started during modernity versus something altogether new or postmodern. A late modern approach shifts trust and authority from the medical domain to the authority of the individual who negotiates the dying and death process with professionals, resulting in advanced care planning or advanced directives, outlining one's wishes should they be incapable of making decisions for themselves at any point in time. These negotiations are influenced by what one sees, hears, and reads. In this choice-centered approach to death that builds on informed decisions and locates the self as the central authority versus a priest or doctor, individuals and/or their families possess agency to make decisions once provided an array of options from professionals and others. I won't go into the particulars of Canada's approach to medical assistance in dying or offer an ethical or theological reflection on the topic. But sociologically, among the over 60,000 Canadians who have turned to MAID since being legalized in 2016 through to the end of 2023, I think it's fair to say that a good death and good life is conceptualized to entail personal choice, agency, and control, along with the absence of pain and suffering, plus access to sufficient health resources. And these values are embraced by a growing group of Canadians. A nationally representative Angus poll with 1,652 Canadians in October 2024 revealed that 76% of Canadians supported the original 2016 MAID bill, where one's natural death was reasonably foreseeable. Lower levels of support, 63%, existed for the 2021 amendment to the MAID bill, where death was not reasonably foreseeable, though there is good reason to believe that widespread Canadian support for MAID will continue to reflect the majority perspective. My point for raising medical assistance in dying is that it typifies the underlying cultural values of a late modern approach to death, where the modern value of control now includes choice, autonomy, and self-sufficiency. Regardless of whether these late modern values resonate with your own view of the world, several criticisms arise in the literature. One of the immediate limitations of a personal choice-based approach is that, unlike in traditional societies, few are socialized with direct personal experience with death. Thus, on what grounds do people make their decisions about dying and death? Related, social psychological research demonstrates how overwhelming it can be to make decisions when one is confronted with too much choice. Additionally, when people seek to use their agency and choice based on informed decisions, sometimes even experts get it wrong in predicting the variables related to death. For example, the anticipated timing or trajectory of a tsunami or wildfire. One final critique regarding the late modern value of choice and control is that some are constrained so much by their life circumstances that they have little agency, choice, or control over how they wish to die or live, a topic I'll return to later. A parallel experience in late modern approaches is this growing psychological focus on dying and death. This includes encouragement to talk about death and grieving more openly and publicly, and to express one's feelings as part of the grieving process. It's possible that these efforts to bring death out into the open is a reaction to the hiddenness of death in modern approaches. Part of this shifting tactic to death, including grieving, reflects that death is a longer process in late modern society, unlike traditional society where the dying process is relatively short. Another component to the psychological emphasis on death in late modern society is found in death rituals like funerals, where individuals and their personalities and life stories take center stage, versus God or religious liturgy, which philosopher and theologian James K.A. Smith unpacks in detail in his book, You Are What You Love. Obituaries are another example of this social change. Recent Canadian-based research by Chris Miller and others document that obituaries have grown in length and shifted in focus over the last 120 years. Although late modern approaches to death and dying are centered more on choice, autonomy, and self-sufficiency, I don't mean to suggest that people's late modern experiences of death and dying are necessarily lonely or devoid of community or interdependence. To the contrary, recall that choice is rooted in an orientation to make informed decisions based on negotiation with health professionals and family members. Moreover, even as grief or death rituals take on a more psychological focus, these often occur within interdependent communal contexts, and/or they reflect the importance of human relationships to human life and death. Expressed differently, we shouldn't think of traditional, modern, or late modern approaches to death in fixed ways. The descriptors offered reveal boundaries that I think are porous. We might find it more helpful to think about these descriptions along a continuum where, for example, the late modern approach to death leans more to the personal choice end of the continuum. Relationships and community can and still do play a pivotal role in this space. To summarize thus far, I have offered a few sociological insights into a good death and a good life, drawing from traditional, modern, and late modern conceptions of death. These range from submitting control over to God, to taking greater control via science and medicine and medical experts, to accepting our finitude, to emphasizing personal choice and autonomy. What these different and sometimes competing ideas suggest is that our answer to this question of a good death and good life is socially and contextually situated. A strength of sociology is the ability to describe and explain how and why different considerations rise to the surface across social environments. In this next section of my lecture, I want to present and unpack some other sociological insights on what a good death and good life entail, drawing on sociological research and concepts over the last century and beyond. A prominent counter-narrative to the late modern emphasis on personal choice, autonomy, and self-determination arises from Hartmut Rosa, a German sociologist. He states in his 2019 book, Resonance, A Sociology of Our Relationship to the World, that a good death and life is defined by, quote, the degree to which one is connected with and open to other people and things, end quote. His grounding concept of resonance is, quote, a relational concept, a mode of being in the world. Two entities in relation in a vibratory medium or resonant space mutually affect each other in such a way that they can be understood as responding to each other, at the same time speaking with its own voice, end quote. For Rosa, the opposite of resonance is alienation, or a relation of relationless with the world around, which could include others, material objects, God, oneself, or creation and nature. Rosa's concept of resonance intersects with much research in sociology and elsewhere on community and social networks. One of the early contributors to sociological thought in the late 19th century, Emil Durkheim, argued in his 1897 book, Suicide, that those most likely to die by suicide were less socially connected. This didn't mean that if you lacked social connections that you would die by suicide, only that those who died by suicide were less likely to have strong social connection versus others. While criticisms have arisen to some of Durkheim's descriptions and analysis, an underlying thread that remains in sociology today is that social connection and community with others has many physical, emotional, mental, and spiritual benefits for individuals and society. Put another way, social death or alienation or disconnection and loneliness can have harmful effects related to physical death and dying. As a recent publication by the Lancet Commission revealed, loneliness can amplify a wish to hasten death. Revisiting Lydia Dugdale in her book, The Lost Art of Dying, she contends that a good death is marked by dying in community and then being mourned by a community. In many respects, this is one expression of resonance as put forward by Rosa. Living and dying in community is part of what gave rise to the first modern hospice at St. Christopher's in London in the 1960s, introduced by Cicely Saunders, a British nurse, social worker, and physician. The aim of palliative care has long been to care for people holistically, including clear communication, relief of symptoms, and compassionate care that accounts for physical, psychological, spiritual, and social considerations. Palliative care is one example of attempts to accompany and be present as a companion to those who are dying and to those impacted by the pending death of a loved one. These efforts reflect a reaction against the alienating effects of a modern society-wide approach to death that is rooted in medicalization, rationalization, professionalization, and institutionalization. This is one of the reasons the Lancet Commission recently called for strengthened relationships and partnerships between those dying, their families, communities, health and social care systems, and wider civic society versus offloading all or most end-of-life care primarily or exclusively to healthcare settings, as valued as these institutions are in society. Here is how John Swinton, a prolific theologian and registered nurse at the University of Aberdeen, frames community in his 2012 book, Dementia, Living in the Memories of God. He says, quote, "In order to belong, one needs to be missed if one isn't there. If they're not missed, they don't belong. And if they don't belong, there is no true community for anyone." End quote. Being part of a community is one of the reasons we have death rituals like funerals. Returning to French sociologist Emile Durkheim in his classic 1915 book, Elementary Forms of the Religious Life, Durkheim states, quote, "When someone dies, the group to which he belongs feels itself lessened, and to react against that loss, it assembles. Collective sentiments are renewed, which then lead men to seek one another and to assemble together," end quote. Rituals like funerals function as markers of social solidarity, where the deceased person transitions from being a living member of the community to an ancestor of the community, expressed through the eulogy, prayer, songs, and images shared in a funeral. Of course, death rituals do not always fulfill the function of drawing people together. People and families and relationships are complex. Death rituals can bring forth strained relational histories, which introduces a larger consideration that I don't have time to explore here, yet would encourage you to think about. What does it mean to die well and thus to live well in the context of interpersonal tensions, hurts, and pains? How might truth and reconciliation, forgiveness, grace, humility, and dignity factor into our considerations? Looking beyond death rituals, the loss of someone from a community is also captured in what scholars refer to as the continuing bonds model. This is where we seek to create and celebrate bonds with a person after they have died through memories, pictures, songs, places, and as I recently learned, through AI. Notwithstanding complicated relationships, efforts to create and sustain continuing bonds can reflect a good life and good death, both for the deceased and those left behind. However, these endeavors are not without their challenges. An emerging area of research inquiry surrounding digital legacy via social media explores the kinds of things that we post online while we're alive, along with the things that remained from others after we have died. In terms of what we post while we're alive, what narratives are we socially constructing about ourselves, and how accurate, true, or idealistic are these presentations of self that may leave a particular image of self once we are no longer here? Interestingly, some estimate that by the year 2100, there will be more Facebook accounts by members who are dead than alive. Then there are the things that loved ones might post after we've died. Personality matters here, both for the deceased and loved ones. Personally, what if I don't want intimate memories, pictures, or stories shared online after I'm dead? Yet loved ones wish to share those things as part of their grieving process. Who should get to decide in these settings, and how might we be respectful of different people's wishes and approaches to grief in the process? Similar questions could be asked of funeral rituals. There are some who do not want a funeral when they die, yet loved ones might. Who should get to decide here, and why? Who are these rituals and social processes ultimately for? Strengthen relationships at these different micro, meso, and macro levels dovetail with another critical sociological consideration on a good death and good life: access to resources. Earlier, I spoke of social death related to those on the margins of social life, which could be tied to social inequalities related to one's gender, social class, disability, religion, or race. The question to consider is, how do social structures benefit some to the exclusion of others that shapes when or how they die, plus the ripple effects on death rituals or a way of life forward for loved ones afterward? Residential schools are a horrendous part of Canadian history that reminds us of how societal structures disadvantage certain groups in this regard. Research elsewhere in the sociology of health is clear that, quote, poorer people are getting sick more often at the receiving end of violence, and are dying earlier than richer people, end quote. The World Health Organization talks about catastrophic health costs, defined when a person spends more than 10% of their income on health-related costs, which encompassed nearly 1 billion people 1 decade ago, and surely is much higher today with the widening gap between those who are economically rich and poor. You might find it interesting and sobering that in the United States, medical costs are the most common cause of bankruptcy. Sociological research is also clear that those with lower socioeconomic status tend to experience fewer social ties and higher rates of homelessness, mental illness, and suicide. Thought of in the context of work and employment, research reveals that as unemployment rises, so too do suicides, homicides, and deaths from stress-related disorders. Access to resources extends to what individuals or nations can or cannot do to mitigate against a variety of death risks in a risk society, a concept that Ulrich Beck and Anthony Giddens explore in detail. For example, access to nutritious food, exercise, clean and safe accommodations where one is not exposed to high crime rates or pollution. This logic additionally applies to global comparisons where economically developed nations like Canada possess far more resources that result in longer life expectancy and higher quality of life versus less economically developed regions of the world. The effects of global warming, such as pollution, floods, and fires, or war, famine, and other mass casualty causes of death, are disproportionately experienced in nations that lack the resources to prepare, defend, or respond against these risks. Thus, when we think about a good death and good life, we must confront access to resources. Who does and does not have access, and how do social structures help or hinder death preparation, defense, or response? Thinking about this on a personal level, if you have access to resources, what is your responsibility to others who lack access? And what is Canada's global responsibility? While those of lower socioeconomic standing experience many constraints, sociological research on work and employment also calls our attention to the harmful effects of working too much that can affect those of lower and higher socioeconomic standing in different ways. For instance, data reveal that growing and unsustainable demands from employers on employees, poor work-life boundaries, whereby we're always available to our coworkers via the technological umbilical cord, yet decreasingly present to family and friends, and working more hours to earn more money to spend even more in a capitalist system, are altogether detrimental to one's overall health and well-being. Simply put, our economic standing and access to resources impacts people in different ways related to living and dying well. In his excellent and thought-provoking 2015 book, Social Acceleration, A New Theory of Modernity, Hartmut Rosa does not necessarily draw these links to social class and access to resources, though I think some of these connections are implied. Rosa contends that in a modern society that is characterized by social acceleration, evident with technology, social change, and pace of life, most associate the good life with the fast or full life. Listen to how Rosa describes the links between life and death in a socially accelerated modern society. Quote, "In answer to the problem of death in late modernity, namely the idea that an accelerated enjoyment of worldly options, a faster life, will once again allow the chasm between the time of life and the time of the world to be reduced. Thus the idea of the good life corresponding to this answer, which historically became the culturally dominant idea, is to conceive of life as the last opportunity. That is, to use the earthly time span allotted to humans as intensively and comprehensively as possible before death puts a definitive end to it. The good life is the full life, and it consists in savoring as much of what the world has to offer as possible and in making use of as many of its possibilities and offerings as one can." End quote. This understanding of the good life is partly marked by capitalism and consumerism, where one seeks to consume material objects, experiences, and relationships in search of one's authentic self, an idea discussed by Charles Taylor in The Secular Age. Implicit in these works by Rosa and Taylor, and explicit in other research, is that our access to resources and economic security also shapes our values, including our ideas of what it means to live and die well. Ronald Inglehart, an American political scientist, argues that those with higher economic security tend to have the time, mental space, and money to devote to quality of life, well-being, pondering meaning in life, individual freedom, and self-expression. The fact that you are watching this lecture is a testament to what Inglehart means. Most of us have the leisure time available to watch this lecture and think about the subject at hand. In contrast, those with less economic security are simply striving to survive day to day. As Tony Walters reminds us, quote, in many parts of the world, the idea that each individual be required to make their own sense of life and death is incomprehensible, end quote. Take bereavement, for example. While those with economic security are encouraged to grieve death in particular ways, by stressing the emotional dimensions and possibly seeking out counseling, those of lower economic security continue to be plagued with material challenges. Hearing from Tony Walter again, quote, the loss of a breadwinner may mean that some children can no longer go to school. School uniforms may now be unaffordable, or children may now have to go to work, end quote. The final substantive aspect that I want to focus on in this lecture grows out of my career-long research as a sociologist of religion, a trajectory that is increasingly accounted for those who say they do not identify with a religion, what sociologists call religious nones, N-O-N-E-S. Based on the 2021 Canadian census, with 35% of Canadian adults now saying they do not identify with a religion, 53% saying they identify as Christian, and 12% identifying with religious traditions outside of Christianity, how might we think about death and dying along a continuum that includes the religious and non-religious and everything in between? What might these changing demographics mean for how we approach death and end-of-life care in Canadian social institutions like law or healthcare? I do not have space to speak to these topics directly, though I want to offer a few empirical observations on some of the ways that those along this religious, non-religious continuum view death and the afterlife. I begin by returning to one of my first books published in 2015, The Meaning of Sunday. In this book, I interviewed 90 people comparing active religious affiliates, those who identify as Christian and attend religious services nearly every week, marginal religious affiliates, those who identify as Christian and attend religious services mostly for religious holidays and rites of passage, and religious nones, those who do not identify with any religion and rarely, if ever, attend religious services. Though death and dying was not a focal interest in that project, the subject did come up. I'm currently in the process of recoding over 3,000 pages of interview transcripts related to this theme because of the frequent and varied ways the subject arose. In the future, I'll write up and present those findings, but for now I want to highlight 3 brief observations that I made in The Meaning of Sunday about these 3 groups and the afterlife. First, active religious affiliates. They are more likely to believe in the afterlife and/or to desire to be there wherever there is, most often conceptualized as heaven. And this is a finding that's well documented in many other surveys as well. Though interestingly, recent research suggests that people's level of certainty in their beliefs about the afterlife is weakening. What's interesting to me is that active religious affiliates tend to live their life with the afterlife on the periphery of their daily thinking or behavior. That is, how most active affiliates live is not driven by how they conceptualize the afterlife, such that they frequently think or behave in certain ways with an eye on internal implications, however conceptualized. Second, marginal affiliates. Many believe in an afterlife, many others are unsure what happens after we die, and some reject the prospect of an afterlife. For those who do believe in an afterlife, conceptualized in various ways from heaven to reincarnation, to a continuing energy, to general uncertainty other than there is something after this life, there is a widespread agreement among marginal affiliates that good people go on to the next life. By this they mean only the worst do not go on to the next life, and by this they mean murderers. In reflecting on their lives, marginal affiliates, and I would note signs of this across all 3 groups, there was an acknowledgement that while many did not see themselves as perfect, they weren't that bad. Notable among young people, there was a sense that they had a lot of life yet to live to become better later on. In short, so long as you were a good person with good intentions, you would obtain the afterlife if you believe there is an afterlife. And then finally, religious nuns. While some religious nuns believe in some kind of afterlife, most are either unsure what happens after we die or reject the existence of an afterlife and maintain that we simply stop existing. And these findings are supported in several other surveys and studies. In adopting these perspectives, a dominant refrain from religious nuns is to live life on earth to the fullest. Whether living life to the fullest here means the same things that Hartmut-Rosa envisioned when discussing the accelerated life, I'm not entirely sure, and more investigation is needed in this regard. For the sociologist, the interesting question in all of this, whether with active affiliates, marginal affiliates, or religious nuns, is how our conceptions of the afterlife possibly impact how we think, behave, and experience the world right now. How are we impacted personally and interpersonally? To what extent do we live well, however defined, in the context of how we conceptualize the afterlife and thus dying well? I don't have time to get into all the great research that is emerging lately by scholars such as Crystal Manning, Laurie Beeman, and Chris Miller. But I want to briefly summarize Crystal Manning's interviews in 2023 publication with 97 religious nuns over the age of 65. On the question of living well, her interviewees spoke of three things: building a legacy, finding joy in this life, and living in the moment. What stood out to me in reading through this research was how people in their latter years of life desire to slow down as a gateway to experience maximal joy, doing the things they love with the people they love. This slow living posture is quite different to how many appear to seek after the good life via the socially accelerated life that Hartmut-Rosa describes. I think Rosa's descriptions are accurate depictions of how many actually live, though perhaps the research from Manning offers a counterpoint to ways we may wish to think about dying and living well. To summarize, a good death and good life has been captured in a myriad of ways in the sociological literature. In no particular hierarchical order, these include convergence of physical and social death, surrendering and submitting control over one's life and death to God, increased control over one's death and life, accepting one's finitude, personal choice, autonomy, control, and self-sufficiency, absence of pain and suffering, access to resources, death literacy, community with others, holistic and integrated system of care and support that is premised on interdependence, the full life, the accelerated life, the slow life. In presenting these ideas, I don't mean to sound definitive or all-encompassing. Sociologically, there are many aspects to dying well and living well in late modern society that warrants careful exploration still. Beyond sociology, other disciplinary approaches to the question of a good life and a good death in late modern society might cause us to question some of the ideas I've just advanced, plus consider other questions or variables. This is good, and I, hopefully along with you, am committed to probing this subject further. I conclude by coming full circle to where I started, Ash Wednesday. For those who follow the rhythms of the Christian calendar, you will know that Ash Wednesday and Lent mark a new season that continue the story started earlier in Advent. As Fleming Rutledge brilliantly showcases in her book titled Advent, few Christian churches, and Protestantism especially, understand that Advent is a season of darkness that progressively moves closer toward the light that is revealed in the Christmas season that follows. Rutledge says that, quote, "The true and victorious Christmas spirit does not look away from death, but directly at it. Otherwise, the message is cheap and false. To be a Christian is to live every day of our lives in solidarity with those who sit in darkness and in the shadow of death, but to live in the unshakable hope of those who expect the dawn," end quote. Theologically, I agree with Rutledge. I think one of the gifts of the Christian calendar is we are constantly invited to consider death, resurrection, life, and hope in an ongoing and meaningful way against the backdrop of a late modern society where few appear familiar with or socialized into death. Sociologically, Rutledge's words represent an invitation into a full yet slow life that is attentive to God, self, others, and creation. One marked by community and interdependence with others toward the provision of resources to all, and rooted in surrendering and submitting one's death and life over to God. And so with that, I conclude my lecture. Thanks so much for watching. I want to invite you to check out my website for updates as my research on this topic progresses, and please feel free to reach out with further thoughts and impressions as we collectively grapple with what it means to die and live well in late modern society. Thanks again for watching.
Thank you, Dr. Thiessen, for joining us this evening. And if you are interested in his newest book, The Stories Congregations Tell, you can get it through our website at ambrose.edu/bookstore. Thanks, everybody, for tuning in. Until next time.